Hello, and welcome to our presentation on the Intelligent Monitoring Framework feature of Veritas Cluster Server. This feature was introduced in VCS version 5.1 SP1. Our goal today is to explain the feature and how it benefits our customers. Let me start off by explaining how most cluster technologies ensure that applications are online, as they all generally work the same way. The resource status could be determined by running a script or monitor program to ensure, for example, the Oracle database is currently active. In another example, we could check the process table to determine that a WebSphere application is running. Clusters have some interval of time for this application monitoring. With VCS, we have an attribute called monitor interval for each resource. It determines how long to wait to check to see that an online resource is still online. We also have an offline monitor interval attribute for the interval of time between monitor checks on the offline nodes. The default value is 60 seconds for the online monitor interval and 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes, for the offline monitor interval. Let's demonstrate what this means in a failure scenario. Since our monitor interval is 60 seconds, that means it could take anywhere between 1 and 59 seconds to determine that a resource is offline. Once the fault is detected, the agent lets the agent framework know that a fault has occurred, and the cluster takes the appropriate action. The primary issues with this methodology is that each monitor cycle uses a portion of the CPU, and the inherent delay for discovering when a resource faults. If a customer has hundreds of mount points, each of those mount points have to be checked every 60 seconds, which can add load to the CPU. With the new Veritas Cluster Server feature, Intelligent Monitoring Framework, we can avoid the traditional monitoring pitfalls. In using a kernel driver to monitor the state of a resource, polling is no longer necessary. With this new framework, supported agent types will register their resources with the kernel driver. After they register, the kernel driver watches for changes in state for the specific process or mount point used by the resource. If a resource changes state, such as an Oracle database process stopping, the kernel driver will immediately recognize the state change and notify the agent framework so the cluster can take the appropriate action. The benefits of using Intelligent Monitoring Framework include immediate resource state change notification and no CPU cycles to run the monitor processes on a continuous basis. See that the key benefits are a lower CPU footprint, the instant notification we just talked about, and the ability to scale to a larger number of resources on a cluster node without impacting that node's performance. Essentially, this is a green technology feature, as it allows customers to make better use of their CPU resources for their applications and not for their clustering software. With each release of VCS after version 5.1 SP1, we are improving on the number of agents that are supported with this feature. IMF is not necessarily a replacement for traditional monitoring. For example, with the Oracle agent, you have the ability to configure a second-level monitor. This gives you insight into the ability of the database to accept reads and writes. You can configure IMF to do the first-level monitoring and have the traditional second-level monitor run on an extended period to ensure the database is fully online. You can also configure IMF to run on the online node, the offline node, both nodes, or disabled. As a note, if anything was to happen to the kernel module, traditional monitoring would kick back in and ensure that the resources were monitored. Also, when the kernel module is alerted that there's a fault, a traditional monitor is run to ensure that the resource is actually offline. With VCS 5.1 SP1, the IMF feature is disabled by default to allow customers to choose to configure the functionality themselves. There is a utility that can be downloaded from sort.symantec.com to enable all agents with one command. It is called HAIMF-config, and it is included with VCS 6.0, but is not with VCS 5.1 SP1. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time.